I'm really excited to be with you all this morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. This is a really wonderful opportunity for us here and to kick off the IP track, the Islamic psychology track. We have four, really incredible panelists that will be giving you some presentations. I think it's a really good start that we're starting with. I think we're going to start with a discussion of field construction. So what we're going to be doing is going from the past to the present. So Dr. Rania Awaad, who is the director of the Muslims and Mental Health Lab at Stanford University at the Department of Psychiatry, is with us, and she is also the clinical director and regional director of Khalil Center in Northern California. And she's going to talk with us about the past, about the history, about contributions of Muslim scholars to the field of psychology, to the conversation of human psychology. And then we will transition to the next topic from there, inshallah. If you have any questions, please feel free to note them in the chat. We will stop with about 30 minutes remaining so that we can have time for some discussion and entertaining some Q&A from the audience, inshallah. Okay, Dr. Awaad, do you want to start us off, please? Jazakumullah khair.
Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. It's an honor and pleasure to be here at the Muslim Mental Health Conference, the 12th annual, and also the first of our opportunities to have the Islamic psychology track. So I'm really excited, inshallah, to be sharing with you and starting off this discussion. I'm going to share my screen, inshallah, so that we can see together the slides. So let me just go ahead and do that. All right, hopefully they'll be loading here soon, inshallah. As Dr. Hooman mentioned, alhamdulillah, today what I'm hoping to do with this part of the talk is to really make sure that everybody comes out of this discussion very clear about the heritage and the history of our Islamic tradition related to psychology. Now, for some, you know this story well. And for others, this is going to be the kind of story that you may not have heard before or realized before. The amount of advancements that the Muslims had related to psychology and to the study, treatment, and understanding of mental health that was far, far before and beyond our European counterparts that are often given credit for the development of the field of psychology. So we have a lot to cover here, and over the course of the 4 panels today, I'll start with the past and we'll build one panel by panel into the present day, inshallah. With that, inshallah, I will let you know that I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. And from here, let's begin our conversation. So when we talk about psychology, we know that in modern psychology, which often is termed as Western psychology, European psychology, that Europe was the birthplace, as it is often told to us in our programs and in the books of psychology, in the books of psychiatry, in the books of the history of medicine that we might read. And often these books neglect to talk about what happened before. And if they do, they often either skim the surface or really start with the Greeks and Romans and really skip over where we have a lot of other advancements, even well beyond the Muslim lands. I want to be clear that it's also not just the Muslims who are lost in this discussion, but even Indian medicine, Chinese medicine, and so on and so forth. But when you look at Islamic history, there's something very, very, very unique to what was first, basically the impetus that Islam brought with it. And we're going to talk about those very understandings, ayats from the Quran, and where scholars are really, and impressed upon them that they need to study the human psychology, mashallah. Consider the Islamic tradition to be holistic in its understanding. It ties together mind and body and spirit. It absolutely wants to take into account and does not shy away from what we today unfortunately think as a stigma or a taboo in discussing mental health, not only in its treatment, but also in its aftercare, which is a beautiful thing that we're going to talk about as well, which basically means how do you reintegrate somebody into society after they have been ill? Not only that, but I want to tell you today and kind of draw the story that we have, this wasn't just in theory. Our scholars, our noble predecessors were able to create whole institutions, like they were able to take from the theory and build into practical. And that's where you see the hospitals, you see the Dar al-Shifa, the places of treatment and healing, the Bimaristan, which basically literally means a place of healing, right? That then start in the Muslim lands and spread all throughout. And they start very early on. We have notions that some of the earliest psychiatric institutions or hospitals that had psychiatric wards started as early as potentially the 7th century and definitely by the 8th century. And then onward in Islamic history, and they pop up all throughout the Muslim world. But that impetus was Islam. There's nothing else to explain what happened and what comes before it that explains that great really growth that happened. And furthermore, as we often say, that period of time, early Islam, in which this is happening in Europe across the way, this is otherwise known as the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages is categorized by many things, but in terms of mental health, it is categorized by a period of time in which people who have mental illness are considered to be witches and burned at the stake at worst. And at best, they are taken to monasteries and religious institutions because what they are deemed to have a spiritual element and need to be seen by those who can to extract, demonic possession from them. So this is very one-sided, whereas Islam comes and says, we have a holistic tradition. And that's what I hope to share with you today, inshallah, because in understanding our tradition, in reviving its history, we also get to revive what today is a revival of Islamic psychology that you see happening before your very eyes today, inshallah. So with that, we talk about the Muslim community being a marginalized community in, non-Muslim majority countries, but even within Muslim majority countries, you find that the topic of mental health continues to be stigmatized and taboo in the modern era. And there's always the question of, well, what went wrong? What happened if we had such a rich history? So let's explore some of this together, inshallah. First, I'm going to define psychology, from its Greek roots as, the psyche, which is the breath, the spirit, or the soul, and logia, which is the study of. Now, we don't have an exact Arabic term called psychology. The equivalent, or a closest equivalent, would be the term ilmun nafs, or knowledge of the soul or the self. And this is important because you see here that the scholars, kind of broadened, and you see in this diagram that I have below for those who are able to read the Arabic, kind of really broadened the discussion beyond just the psyche. And this is very key. And if we have time, we would delve into this, and probably in the upcoming panels, we'll have more diving into this very discussion. But when you look at Islamic psychology, we're talking about empirical, rational, scriptural, depending on the understanding of the scripture, of the scriptures of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah. But we're also talking physical and metaphysical. We're talking about a very holistic understanding. Where you compare this to modern Western psychology, what you have is a very strictly empirical and often very rational approach. If you can't prove it, if I can't touch it, if I can't, repeat it, then it doesn't exist. And as we know, as Muslims, in the discussion of the nafs and the discussion of the ruh, right, the concept of the soul, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said in the Quran that He has only given us but a certain limited amount of that information. So we can't just categorically throw that away. And that is where you find modern psychology kind of butting heads, where we are currently with the topic of Islamic psychology. Although there are many aspects of modern psychology that integrate beautifully as well. So let's take a look here what we have. What are the motivations? You see here from the Quran and the Sunnah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly taught us that He's going to show us signs in the horizons, but also within ourselves that will allow us to see the truth. And you see here from the Maqasid al-Sharia, which is basically the Islamic legal principles, that the concept of preservation of the self and the intellect is key. and is a foundation from which we build so much of our Islamic rulings. And you see here from the Sunnah, from the Hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ says that in the body there is a piece of flesh, that if it is sound, the entire body is sound. And if it's corrupted, the entire body is corrupted. That is the heart. So the concept of having the heart or the qalb in the center of the discussion, as you saw in the previous diagram, is incredibly important here. So we can't also take heart and we can't take ruh out of the discussion, but they often don't have a place in modern psychology. So let's continue here. So what inspired our Muslim predecessors, our noble predecessors, in really figuring this discussion out? First and foremost, we see that when you look at some of the scripture, some of the manuscripts of the scholars, and for those who are familiar with the work of the Muslim Mental Health Lab, we have taken so many of these manuscripts, and the primary manuscripts written in Arabic, Farsi, Ottoman Turkish, and actually started to translate and to work through the understandings of the noble predecessors who have actually attempted to figure out what does human psychology, what is it all about, and what does it mean? And they have, and I'll show you some of their work, but they have been far advanced, than what we have ever given them credit for. Not only that, but when you look at them, so many of them, because people might say, well, isn't it just a translation of the Greeks and the Romans, which is exactly what you might read in the books of the history of psychology. Certain authors in particular, like Barrios and others who are very famous historians of psychology, when they mention the Muslims, they literally say, some just forget us altogether, but some, when they mention us, they literally say, here came the Greek and Romans, this is what they contributed to psychology, next came the Muslim Empire, and all they did was translate the works of the Greeks and Romans, and then they jumped mostly to Freud after that, completely ignoring that not only did we, yes, in fact, translate the works of the Greeks and Romans, but in addition to that, added an immense amount of advancements. And like I said, it wasn't just theory. You see the actual practical implementation in the hospitals and the treatments that were created. And so if you look, for example, at Ibn Rushd, who says here that absolutely you were taking from what is understood in the Quran, right? Or Ibn Mishkawayh, who says very similarly that it is the very fact of what is taught in the Quran and the Sunnah that then inspires them to really study the soul. So with that, we realize this is not merely a translation of the Greeks and the Romans. And if you look then also further, and especially when we look at scripture, this is key to the study of Islamic psychology, that you can't actually have an Islamic psychology unless it is rooted and based in the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is exactly what the scholars have done. Some of whom, it's a spectrum, some of whom, just like a modern Muslim scientist today, modern Muslims, psychologists or scientists today, there is a spectrum of understanding and of integration of the faith into their science. Some heavily draw from the Quran and the Sunnah, and others are inspired by it, right? And this is exactly what you saw in the noble predecessors as well, where you have some who are more inspired by it, and others who directly pulled from the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And I think that's really a key kind of understanding to this discussion. Now, for sake of time, because I want to get to some of the key kind of people and advancements, I want to share with you that in the 7th to 15th century, where there was a flourishing, if you will, and really this timing goes even into modern times, into the Ottoman Empire, because the seat of power and knowledge continues to move depending on where that seat is. But there was definitely a flourishing that started in the 7th century onwards. And it was an intellectual flourishing. Most Muslims know this and are very proud of their history of the advancements of science and medicine and humanities. But mental health also was advanced. And you see here where the first seat of knowledge is in Baghdad, and you have, this kind of beehive of translations of works that are happening from the Greeks and Romans. And then there are people throwing things out that don't fit with Islam and adding to it what does work with Islam. Who are these people? Well, they're not limited to scientists, and they're not limited to physicians. Today, psychiatry is largely within the field of medicine, but they are not limited to physicians or scientists, or even the theologians. They are all three contribute, and that's going to be a key part of our discussion today. Who are these people? So let's do kind of a brief kind of very, very brief. And I urge you that if you're interested in this and want to have more information about all the people that we're discussing, all of what I'm saying here today is actually derived from a chapter, I believe it is chapter 3, in the very newest book that Khalil Center has publicly, jointly published, that is available today. And at the end of my slides, I'll put a picture and a link to that, on the Introducing Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy. So we're really excited to have this history chapter where we go in depth about some of these forerunners of psychology. But very briefly here, if you look at Al-Kindi, this is the slide on the philosophers. And the philosophers also contributed to mental health and understanding of psychology. And you see here Al-Kindi, for example, who writes so many manuscripts, over 200 of them, 5 are related to psychology. I don't know how many people knew that. And how he was able to reconcile between Greek philosophy and between Islamic philosophy. And in his books on psychology, he specifically talks about cognitive strategies for depression, right? He talks about repelling sorrow, and this is actually one of the manuscripts we're currently translating in the lab. I'm very excited about it. Hopefully we'll have that for you soon, ready to be published. And you look at Ibn Mashkawayh, who comes slightly after him, and he also is talking about psychology, and in this, moral positive psychology is what we might call it today, in terms of pain and pleasure and happiness, self-regulation. These concepts may seem new age, they may seem like they're only in the modern era, but they were absolutely created by and the beginning of the discussions, and in some cases, novel discussions by our predecessors. You look at someone like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and you see here that he talks about the self and internal senses, right? Perception and imagination. You see here that he talks about how whatever was revealed by God is flawless. And therefore, that is the base everything is moved from, which you see is a very different discussion than a modern psychologist or scientist might take, right? That starts from empiricism. I have to prove it first, and only if I can replicate it scientifically does it exist, right? A completely different frame. Look at Al-Farabi, for example. And even though as philosophers, they may have some contentions in the world of philosophy, the works that they had contributed to mental health are incredibly important and interesting. He writes a lot on social psychology and on happiness, right? There's a lot of discussion here on the topic of happiness, but also interestingly, he talks about the effect of music on the soul. And here we see the beginnings of the creation of music therapy, which the Muslims created and implemented in their hospital systems and in their bimadistans that I was referring to earlier. This is key.
Dr. Rania, I just want to give you a 2-minute
Thank you.
Note.
Yes, we're almost there. The physician's perspective, if you look at some of who are the key people in this slide, there's so many here, but we chose to highlight just a few. We have Abu Bakr Razi, who was one of the most famous, if you will, who directed the largest hospital and largest psychiatric ward at the time in Baghdad, and had so many case studies specifically on mental health. And not only that, but he really pioneered the topic of aftercare. So after a person comes into the hospital for treatment, and after they leave, how do they reintegrate into society? How do we fund this system? So it's fully funded and protected and by the awqaf or by the zakat monies that were collected. And also when they are discharged, they also receive funding to be able to reintegrate properly into society. That's a beautiful thing. Balkhi, those of you who know me know that I talk about Abu Zayd al-Balkhi to no end. MashaAllah, these are Abu Zayd al-Balkhi in particular, somebody that I've published on a few different papers. And I'll just say in brief, that in the topic of what we discovered about al-Balkhi's work related to OCD specifically, obsessive compulsive disorder, and on phobias, which are the papers that are published, that he meets his understanding in the 9th century meets the criteria of DSM-5 today. If you don't know about this, I urge you to take a look at it closer. We could have had a whole talk just on al-Balkhi, mashallah, but it's really key and important. And if you look at Ibn Sina, of course, he goes without saying because of so much of his advancements, but I'll tell you that the European medical schools continue to have the works of Ibn Sina in their schools until about the 18th century. So the canon of medicine, just to tell you. I won't have time to go through all of the theologians, but some of them are here in front of you to let you know kind of how massive and extensive the work of even the theologians were. So Imam al-Ghazali, for example, and even some of the scholars that you may hear commonly, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, who all contributed to the understanding of Islamic psychology. So where do we go from here? And why are we highlighting these very important people and advances? And this is where kind of I'll end here this discussion, just to say that there is, this concept of the barriers, if you will, which will be talked about further in the panels. And what happens is a very important story. And the story of colonialism is an important story. The story of losing kind of that tradition, adopting a foreign tradition or a tradition that was not holistic in its nature, the way the Islamic tradition was, is key to the breakdown of why we lost so much of what we have, and also key to understanding how to revive Islamic psychology today, right? And with that, I'm going to just sort of leave you here with the most recent advancements, definitely some of the main texts and books that we're working on translating within the lab, but also letting you know that this concept of really understanding the standards that our noble predecessors built, what inspired them, right? Being fully rooted in Islamic tradition is going to be key in furthering the field of Islamic psychology in the modern era today. And here is that book that I was referring to. This is our newest publication. It's available for pre-order all on the Routledge site and also on Amazon's site, Applying Islamic Principles to Clinical Mental Health Care, Introducing Traditional Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy, the tip model that Khalil Center has. And as I mentioned, so much of what I took, if you weren't able to catch all the slides, it's okay, because all of it is actually in the chapter in this book. And I hope, inshallah, you find that to be a benefit. And lastly, I leave you with my contact information. You're always welcome to reach out, especially if you're interested in history and the history of Islamic psychology. And with that, we'll carry on with the rest of the panel. Barakallahu feekum. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Rania, for this wonderful presentation. We'll get an opportunity to kind of ask you some questions and get some further insights from you regarding your presentation. At this point, I want to turn it over to Chaplain and Nihal, who is joining us from Connecticut. He is a graduate of the Hartford Seminary Islamic Chaplaincy Program. He's also a graduate from a traditional Islamic seminary in Nadwa in India as well. And he has a keen interest in exploring some of the historical developments around mental health, his work with mental health, and I'll let him speak about some of his work, but I know that he certainly shared with me a dissertation that he wrote on this very topic, master's dissertation, and I found it to be very intriguing and a wonderful contribution to the field. So welcome, Chaplain Nihal. Jazakumullah khair for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. How's everyone doing? Can you hear me all right?
Alaikum salam. Yes, you're fine. Just to keep in mind the time, you have 15 minutes, inshallah.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I'm going to see if I can just do the slide view. Let's see. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Thank you to Dr. Keshavarzi for allowing me to present on some of the details that I have within this thesis. And thank you to Dr. Rania Awaad, as usual. Her perspective brings a lot of light. So for those of you, to give you a background, I'm the Director of Religious Affairs at the Islamic Center of Connecticut here in the Hartford, Connecticut area. And one thing which was really interesting to me was how within the Islamic tradition, there's always been an emphasis on understanding the intersection and the mixing between a variety of different sciences within Islam. So you have the textual tradition between the Quran and the Hadith. There is also, and specifically I'm focusing on the Sunni canon. I haven't done much research on the Shia canon, but specifically within the Sunni discourse here. But between the Quran and the Hadith, and then also within Islamic jurisprudence, within fiqh, and then also in the realm of ilm al-kalam and aqidah, which would basically be theology. For the sake of this discussion, I'm going to very briefly gloss over the Quranic aspect of it, just because of the fact that we are very, want to be respectful of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. The point to keep in mind over here is that within the Islamic tradition, the mental capacity or mental health, or however you want to look at it, has been measured in a variety of ways. And I'm going to be talking about mental capacity specifically, because mental health is a general and a generic title that we use, but we're also dealing with the idea of anachronisms. And anachronism, for those of you that don't have an academic grounding, is that there is a concept that was formulated, let's say in 2015 or in 2010. And if we're talking about it in the context of the Quran and the Hadith, which is like 1400 years ago, obviously the way we have framed that subject most likely will not be part and parcel exactly in the way that a subject that we are comparing it to, such as the Quran and Hadith, may exactly line up. So just to keep that point in mind as well. So for this discussion, I'm actually not going to go through everything here. We're just going to quickly gloss over aspects of the Quran and the Hadith. So we'll get right into it. Number one, does the Quran actually speak about the idea of mental capacity? And actually, if you know the last two verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second surah in the Quran, we know these verses. The first part of this verse mentions that God does not make responsible a soul, except that it is within its capacity, which the Arabic is لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. That you will not be made responsible for something except that it will be in your capacity to execute it. So it's a divine commandment within the Quranic discourse that if something is seemingly very hard or it's difficult and it's within your capacity to do that, and you've been given a burden, then you should do your best to go and try and work on that. And the initial backing of these verses, the reason of revelation, the sabab al-nuzul, was that the verse before this, in verse number 286, the verse is not listed here. Allah, in the Quran had mentioned that if you reveal something or hide it, we will bring you to account for it. So that actually brought some of the companions to be a little disturbed, saying, hey, we have all these bad thoughts that come to us. So how is it that if a bad thought is coming to us, we're going to be held responsible for it, even when we're not acting upon it? And at that point, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had told them to simply continue to stay firm in what they had been commanded. Eventually, this verse 287, was revealed, saying that no, God will not make you responsible beyond that which you have the capacity to do. Meaning that a form of cognitive restructuring occurred, as we would call it, wherein they were given a task which was a bit tough, but then because they went through that, the burden of it was eased, and then eventually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieved them of that situation. Now, another verse in the Quran, which we'll get into, we won't actually get into right now, but I actually want to get into an example of the Hadith. This is a famous prophetic narration where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, "Rufi al-qalam an thalath." The pen is lifted from three, right? The pen has been lifted from three, and this is in reference to destiny. That destiny is lifted in regards to three people. Number one is an naimi, the person who is sleeping, hatta yastayqid. If they do something while they're in a state of sleep, then they are generally not held responsible for whatever actions occur. Number two is a child until the child comes of age. وعن الصغير حتى يكبر until the child reaches an age of maturity, they're not held responsible for their actions. And then number three, وَعَنِ الْمَجْنُونِ, and of the person who is majnoon. And the other word in another narration is ma'tu, and we're going to be talking about both of these very briefly. حَتَّى يَعْقِلَ أَوْ يَفِيقَ. So the person who is majnoon, they basically lost their mental reasoning ability, their cognitive ability to reason is not at 100%. But at what percent are we going to talk about a person being legally exempt from their actions within Islamic law? So we're going to get into that. So this is a famous hadith where one can even talk about and say that insanity defense may have been practiced in a medieval Islamic era, very shortly after the Prophet ﷺ's demise, where a woman had committed adultery, right? And in medieval Islamic law, somebody who had committed adultery would be put to death if they were married. So the narration mentions that Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was a companion and the second Khalifa of Islam within the Sunni tradition, had committed adultery, and eventually he decided to exercise capital punishment on this woman through stoning. And then Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and also within the Sunni tradition, the fourth caliph, became very angry and said that the woman should be set free. And the reasoning that Ali actually used was that he said that the woman is not in her right state of mind, and he quoted that hadith about the pen being lifted from the three people. Umar replied in the affirmative and then set the woman free after that, because he said that the woman is not in her right state of mind wherein she committed this act, so she should be let go. Now, let's take a look at it from a different perspective. We often, within a room of therapy, talk about cognitive restructuring, talking about using cognitive behavioral therapy to help a client understand and re-examine their negative thoughts. Now, within the concept of therapy, of cognitive restructuring, if you have a Muslim client, this would be a very useful tool to help them actually reword what it is that they are seeing within themselves. So there is this famous hadith where the Messenger ﷺ said in regards to God, that God said, which is known as a hadith Qudsi, it's a special type of hadith, where God is saying that I am as my servant expects me to be. Ana inda dhanni abdi bi. That if you see God in a positive light, then God will see you in a positive light. But if you see God in a non-positive light, then you will not see God in a positive, and you will also see God in a non-positive light. So the point being is that the way we perceive things directly impacts the actions that will result from those thoughts. And within the tradition of Islamic spirituality, of tasawwuf, of tazkiyah, is exactly that. What is the emotional and mental inclination of the person in front of us? That's the most important point for us to understand. Now, I want to jump into another subject. Mental capacity in Islamic jurisprudence. This was actually what the majority of my master's dissertation was about. The main question that I sought to answer was, how is mental health measured through the means of Islamic jurisprudence, through the means of fiqh, through the means of usul al-fiqh? And it's really interesting because in the 11th century, you have somebody like Sarakhsi, who, what's interesting about him is that he's actually considered within the Hanafi school of law to be one of the founders of the subject of usul al-fiqh, the subject of derivatives, like how do you actually derive Islamic law? So that's actually been a constant discussion. He died in the year 1090, and he's an indispensable resource for discerning the study of mental capacity in Islamic law, because during this time period, he focused just specifically on the higher objectives of Islamic law. And the thing that he had mentioned was that there are certain conditions that are required for someone to be considered responsible for their actions. Number one, they have a full grasp of their intellect, aka the aql, right? Number two is that they've reached puberty, bulugh. Now look at what these two things are. A full grasp of your intellect, aka you have a mental responsibility. And then number two, your physical body, that you have attained, you've gone through puberty, so you're now considered an adult. Now, more often than not, we know this, as a therapist, you may know this, that somebody who may come into your office, right, may have gone through the physical aspect of bulugh, but their aql, their mind may be lacking. Maybe their inner child is still very hurt. Maybe they have abandonment issues, and maybe that leads to other things to occur, which removes them from the ability to be responsible in the eye of Islamic law for their actions. Like oftentimes when a person well-rooted in the science says that potentially somebody is exempt from the law, number one, it's not done easily. Number two, when it is determined, it is done so to safeguard the person at hand. So it's important to understand one lacking in either of these two would be considered deficient in their ability to perform an action, right? So exempting someone from possessing full legal capacity in the eyes of the law. Now, does that mean that if a client...
Just wanted to give you the 2-minute marker.
Got it. So does that mean if a client of yours wakes up one day and says, I'm just not feeling it? No, you have to go into a diagnosed session to be able to move on from it. And then I'll quickly go through this. There are 3 major impediments that Sarakhsi and others had spoken about. Dr. Keshavarzi had also written a lot in regards to material speaking about what has been said in regards to impediments in Islamic law. Number 1, ata, which is cognitive deficiency, where somebody has dementia, somebody has a solid mental impairment. And this is someone who this is a form of insanity according to many. It is a form of junun. Number 2 is dahash, blunder or confusion or a loss of reason. This could be an impulse that you cannot control. It could be a form of temporary insanity that's leading you to act out. Certain forms of compulsion can also be brought in. And I've put this verse of the Quran on the side where Allah says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. The word for heart is often qalb, but the word here used is fu'ad. And Arabic grammarians say that the word fu'ad is actually a heart that is so emotionally engulfed that it cannot control the actions that it does. And then number 3 is the idea of safa, someone that's foolish, right? And the idea of safa is rushd, is mental soundness. It's a weakness in someone's mind. Maybe they just don't know how to manage their wealth, or there's some anxiety that may be taking over them, or there's something stopping them, which is not major, which can easily be resolved to actually come to a stage where they are able to be of a sound mind. So according to Imam Abu Hanifa or the Hanafis, that person is treated like a minor, but they're not absolved of legal capacity. And now I'll end off on this because there are so many further subjects in Islamic jurisprudence related to mental health. You have these 5 subjects, which, you know, I can take a whole day talking about this. But number 1 is hajar, it's the idea of interdiction. AKA, if your 5-year-old takes your credit card and buys $2,000 worth of video games on Amazon, does Islamic law oblige you to pay for that? And the answer to that is no, because there's reasons and boundaries created to make sure that somebody's legal capacity is not taken seriously based on the state that they're in. Number 2 is taklif. To have legal capacity, you need to have mental capacity, which is ahliya, number 3 here. And I just spoke about mental capacity, and there's many types of mental capacity. Number 4, there's a subject in Islamic law, the legal subject in Islamic law. Who is the dhimmi and the mahkum alayh, upon whom is an action fard upon whom is an action deemed obligatory upon. And then number 5, theological connotations, referring to like ilm al-kalam, referring to aqidah, where questions arise. Is it a rational choice to receive an obligation? Is there a difference between receiving an obligation versus having the ability to act on the obligation? How do you do that? For example, you know how to pray, but your legs are broken. So how do you pray? So these things are theological in their nature, but then they relate very heavily to Islamic jurisprudence. And, you know, you can get more into it. And then eventually my research built off of this, which a lot of other scholars have spoken about, you know, through the Muslim Mental Health Conference and whatnot. You know, how do we actualize a form of cognitive behavioral therapy for the Muslim community? And, you know, in regards to traumas in the Muslim American community, the rise of Islamophobia, racism in the Muslim community. For example, the Black Muslim experience is not the same as the immigrant Muslim experience. And within the immigrant Muslim experience, you have the Indian, the Pakistani, or the South Asian Muslim experience versus the Arab Muslim experience versus the Balkan Muslim experience within America. And then what are other traumas? Maybe domestic violence comes into play, addiction comes into play, Islamophobia comes into play. So all these different things can be examined in many ways. You can build on this as well. How were Muslims perceived during the Cold War era versus post 9/11 and now post Trump? So that's what I have for you all. And, you know, thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity. And I will yield my, if there's, I don't think I have any time to yield. So I'm done, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Sidi Nihal. It was excellent, mashallah. I think a very rich demonstration and display of the Islamic intellectual heritage by getting into actually discussing some of the topics within fiqh and within the field of Islamic spirituality. Now, Aqila, can we play Dr. Amr Haque's presentation at this point?
Let me just get it pulled up.
And we may need to cut it off, you know, promptly at 15 minutes, inshallah. I know it goes a bit longer. While we're waiting, just want to introduce Dr. Amr Haque is currently in Qatar, and those who have read anything on Islamic psychology know that you will find many articles that he's published, and he's one of the you know, earlier you know, pioneers, I would say, within the field that has been writing long before many of us, and I welcome him to provide his presentation today. Jazakumullah khair. There's no sound, Aqila.
Okay, sorry, give me 1 second.
Sure.
Organizing this event at such a challenging time during the pandemic. I wanted to come to Chicago in March, but the conference was postponed. Still, due to your commitment and hard work, you managed to arrange this conference online. Congratulations. I had personally dropped the idea of presenting my paper at this conference, but when Abdallah Rothman asked me to send a recording, I decided to talk on a topic that he helped me come up with. The title of my talk is Islamic Psychology Field Construction, a look at the past and present. When we talk about this exciting and emerging field called Islamic psychology, I'm sure you would agree that this terminology did not exist in the history of social sciences literature. However, the equivalent term in Arabic, ilm al-nafs, did exist in the past and studied by early Muslim scholars within the field of Islamic philosophy. Additionally, if we search for psychological terms in the Quran, we find nafs mentioned 295 times, qalb more than 130 times, and ruh at least 24 times. Through these terms, the Quran conveys some very profound meanings about human nature. So we can say that while the term Islamic psychology is contemporary, the Quran introduced these concepts more than 1400 years ago. We are also aware how early Muslim scholars, starting from the 7th century AD, or soon after the demise of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, until the 10th century, wrote extensively about human nafs and its manifestations and interplay with similar other entities within the individual self. That era of Muslims and their intellectual contributions expanded globally for more than 1,000 years. But around the 14th century, the Islamic sciences came to a halt for a variety of reasons, mainly because of the closing of the doors of ijtihad, or independent reasoning among Muslims. The closing of ijtihad obviously led to the freezing of knowledge from what was already known at the time and directed Muslims towards taqlid, or imitation of knowledge without reasoning. I will not get further into this topic because it is outside the scope of my talk, but the fallout from ending ijtihad is taught the Muslims to examine the existing knowledge from an Islamic perspective. Many Muslim scholars now believe that the blind imitation of secular and borrowed knowledge resulted in young Muslims losing faith in their own civilization and cultures that eventually caused an intellectual crisis in the Muslim mind. This is the backdrop of where Muslim scientists and scholars have been in the last several hundred years. and psychologists are no exception. If we do a survey of Muslim psychologists today, we will see that most, if not all, are trained in secular schools of psychology. Islamic psychology is basically a new kid on the block. While Islamic psychology is trying to establish itself in some countries, Muslim psychologists and students are in general almost oblivious of their own intellectual traditions and the Islamic worldview of human nature. Malik Badri pointed this out many years ago, that Muslim psychologists are often more ardent supporters of secular psychology than the Westerners, and indicated in his informal conversations that if Islamic psychology were to take roots and become a formal discipline, it would most likely be spearheaded by Western psychologists who revert back to Islam. In my view, despite being generally secular, the Western mindset is more open to change. We know how multicultural psychology flourished in America, and the strength with which spiritual psychology and counseling has become more robust over the years. You may know that the head of the Division of Spiritual Psychology in APA, Dr. Thomas Plant, is now running for the APA president. You may also know that Christian psychology has made deep inroads in the West, particularly in the United States. There are several established Christian psychology programs and grad schools in the US now, and all this resulted from the hard work of the supporters of this discipline. A prominent name in Christian psychology is Kirk Kilpatrick, who wrote the book Psychological Seduction, The Failure of Modern Psychology. This was almost 40 years ago, in which he claims that despite modern psychology's growth over a century, there is a continued increase in crimes, divorce rates, drug abuse, and a general dissatisfaction with life in the US. He calls modern psychology antisocial because it is built on a theory of individualism and materialism. He is opposed to the notion of self-actualization because it is based on the idea of self-centeredness that cannot create or maintain a socially harmonious culture and is irrelevant for people who come from collectivistic cultures. For Kilpatrick, modern psychology is more in the business of prescription rather than description, and looks for solutions before understanding the problems, as it ignores the unobservable. Similarly, C.S. Lewis from Britain points out that modern psychology cannot answer the deeper questions. For example, what he calls the inconsolable longing, which means that doesn't matter how much of the world we possess, there's always a feeling of incompleteness or dissatisfaction from within. For Lewis, the problem with psychology is its incomplete account of human experience. Now, if we look at the religiosity surveys in the US, 95% of the people over 50 years of age classify themselves as religious, and 70% attend a church. For psychologists to ignore these spiritual aspects of human nature is a major shortcoming of the discipline. And for me personally, this is utter negligence of an important element of human nature. These concerns by many psychologists over the years led to the development of integration of psychology and religion. Well, and then there's the case of William James and the entire history of how psychology was shaped by secular forces, which is a whole another topic of discussion we can save for later. But in the more recent past in the US and also in other parts of the world, the development of multicultural psychology, spiritual psychology, and more importantly, the indigenization of psychology movement are precursors for many young Muslim psychologists to think about their own religious psychology based on the Quranic paradigm. with efforts from several individuals in the initial stages, and now from a larger group of people, we see serious interest in establishing Islamic psychology as a formal discipline. So where do we stand in terms of the integration of Islam and psychology? We know that Iqra is the first word in Quran, and the Prophet was asked not just to read, but also to comprehend and apply the Quranic injunctions in his daily life. The Quran is replete with the verses on pondering, reflecting, and applying that which is revealed in the Holy Book. So why did the Muslims never integrate Quranic verses and its concepts in the study of human behavior? Goes back to the problem of taqleed, of secular psychology. The secularization of psychology neglected the moral and spiritual phenomena within man and led to the development of theories that are deterministic and leave little or no room for human volition. This concept is contrary to the Islamic paradigm, where humans have substantial room for free will. The good news is that we now see a deep interest among some Western educated psychologists to critically evaluate the concepts and theories of modern psychology from an Islamic lens and investigate the concepts of nafs, qalb, ruh, aql, etc., given in the Quran, a book of divine guidance for all humans. Knowledge integration between Islam and psychology is essential in at least 4 main areas. The course is taught, intrapersonal integration of the psychologist, integration in research, and integration in training. This model is basically the version used in Christian psychology programs in the US and can serve as a guideline to construct the field of Islamic psychology around the globe. So if we were to do course integration in Islamic psychology, we can think of courses on the concept of human nature in Islamic perspective, theological or theoretical foundations of Islamic psychotherapies, theological and psychological models of disorders, Islamic interventions, spiritual interventions for psychological disorders, cross-cultural issues in psychology and theology, etc. In the area of intrapersonal integration of the psychologist, we may look at training that addresses the issue of developing personal congruence between self and theology, that is, religious beliefs, faith, etc. I wrote a paper back in 1996 on the need for cognitive structuring of Muslim psychologists before an endeavor into IP ever becomes possible. This would constitute a reflection on psychologists' own theological and psychological beliefs and discuss how one's own personality and theology could work in cohesion. In the area of research integration, the possibilities are endless. There can be studies on the challenges of developing an integrated mindset, research on religious growth in children, conflict resolution in Islamic perspective, religion and positive youth development, spirituality measurement scales, religious coping in health-related matters, stem cell research, psychoethics, etc. And in the area of clinical training, integration could take place in areas of religious-based assessments, religious-based therapies, supervision of students, also from an integrated perspective, and integrated symposiums and seminars on a variety of topics. Dr. Malik Badri and I were invited in an IP conference in the year 2000 in Sydney, Australia, when I proposed an IP course covering almost all of the above 4 areas of integration. But that effort was individual and preliminary, and it never took off. The field of IP has made much progress in the last 20 years, and we have a lot more ideas today to work with. Keshavarzi and I published 2 research papers in 2013 and 2014 on integration of Islamic concepts and methods in therapy. We published again in 2017 with Khan and Rothman, highlighting the need for integration between Islam and psychology. Many points are covered in those papers that can be instrumental in constructing not just the courses, but all 4 areas I mentioned above. Badri's work on the dilemma of Muslim psychologists influenced me back in 1982 when I was a master's student in Michigan, followed by the environment in which I ended up at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, an institution that was created to Islamize knowledge. That too is another topic of discussion, because some scholars say that knowledge is already Islamic, and all you need to do is to sift the truth from the untruth. This is the philosophical debate and outside the scope of my talk. But I was fortunate enough to have been in the midst of some very learned scholars in Malaysia, most notably Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, who wrote the book, The Nature of Man and Psychology of the Human Soul. Islamic psychology field construction is much easier today than it was 20 years ago. Badri, as a pioneer of Islamic psychology, has written many books. Rashid Skinner was also one of the first proponents of IP. And he presented a paper in Malaysia back in the mid-90s. That paper found a place in one of my edited books on psychology of personality, Islamic perspectives, published in 2005.
Thank you, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Amber Haque. Alhamdulillah, he's joining us, and he will actually be on the panel. Inshallah, I've noticed that he's on the panel. It's a very much appreciated contribution, and he's one of the, I would say, legends and pioneers in our in this field, mashallah. And we're really honored to have him on this panel. I want to turn it over to Abdallah Rothman, Dr. Rothman, to take it from here. Dr. Rothman is the president and co-founder, not the president, but the executive director and co-founder of the International Association of Islamic Psychology. It's an organization that has developed in the past 2 years, and for those who joined the pre-conference program, they have learned a little bit about it. Dr. Rothman has a doctorate degree in psychology, and he's also a clinician. And so he brings together both the academic kind of development and construction of the field. He's making some significant contributions, and I consider him a dear friend and colleague in which we've been collaborating in recently over the past couple of years on various topics, and most notably this conference, bringing together the collaboration on the conference with the various entities. Dr. Rothman, the floor is yours. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Hooman. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's great to be here. Hooman and I have been working behind the scenes in partnership of getting this conference together, specifically this Islamic psychology track. So I won't go into details of that, but hopefully if you didn't get the chance, you can see the pre-conference that we did with Professor Malik Badri. So that's available online. It would be great for you to go there. But I'm going to jump into presenter mode. And basically, we've been hearing these brilliant presentations from my colleagues on just, presenting this rich tradition and history that we have within the Islamic tradition for psychology, and that there's not only a history to the development of where we are to this point, but that just we have this unlimited resource in the Quran and the Sunnah, and this is really where we need to be centering our understanding of Islamic psychology. And so now it's we've seen all of that my colleagues have presented. Now what do we do with that? How do we work towards making that integrated in a way that is easy for us to understand in the modern context and in this field of psychology that we're using, we're using this word psychology and what it means for what we understand that to be now in our modern context. And so what I'm going to talk about is a research project that I've been working on to develop a theoretical structure and framework for how to do this, really just to get the ball rolling, because there's so much work that we're all doing to develop and build this field, and there's lots of different ways to approach it. And so I want to introduce this. So I'm going to talk about the research, the context of it, the research aims, a little bit on the method. I know we're short in time, so I'm going to probably zoom through a lot of this, and then talk about the results of what came out of it in terms of a model, and then how we can move forward with that. And so the context of this research was really everything that has been presented before me in this panel, just this understanding that there is this rich tradition. And in my experience as a psychotherapist practicing within the Muslim community for the past 15 years, and my own study with scholars and trying to do this work of integrating the Islamic principles into practice, there's just a sort of blaringly obvious need to do more integration and have it come from a place that is rooted in the Islamic tradition. And there's a lot of people doing this work over a period of time and sort of trying to integrate oftentimes the work of psychologists, because they're familiar with that field. And there is sort of a lack of an articulated framework that is really rooted in the Islamic sciences. And then understanding that what that means is that it's rooting it in this Islamic paradigm and not just a cultural adaptation of Western psychology, what we've learned in our psychology training from academia, but really from the ground up. Professor Malik Bazri talks about building a new building from the ground instead of just taking the old building and painting it with an Islamic paint. And so it's constructing from the Quran and Sunnah and really understanding the ontological framework of how we understand human nature, as that is the basis for psychology. And so the aims of this research was to develop a credible, data-grounded way of approaching that. It's a huge project to approach. There's many different ways you can approach this. But the way that I did this in this project was through to really bring in as much of the input from scholars as possible, and not just have it be coming from psychologists, but really understanding that we need to be working together, the people who are scholars of different even branches of knowledge of Islam, and bringing that knowledge into the construction of this field. And because this is really an ummah-wide project that we need to do, not just within the field of Muslim psychologists per se. And so the aim was to identify the key concepts that can constitute an Islamic psychology. So, what are the most important things? You can get really lost in the whole world of theology and all these different aspects of the different permutations of what it can be. But I think my aim was thinking about Islamic psychology for the purpose of clinical application. And so some of that means having to sort of boil it down into what's most useful for that context. And then so that we can build clinical approaches from there. The method that I use is grounded theory, just because, we're talking about theory when you're talking about something like Islam and a revealed religion, it is not up for debate, right? Islam is Islam. We know what we know from Allah directly, from the Quran and from the Sunnah. And so it's not a theory in the sense of coming up with new theory. It's understanding Islam as it relates to what do we already have to know about the psychology of the human being. And it's not necessarily even just adapting and reconfiguring. It's really looking with the lens of the Quran has it all there, and it's all laid out for us, as Dr. Rania described through all the scholars that have been talking about this for so long. And so this approach is trying to develop a theory from the data, rather than coming at it from this place of well, there's already a theory of how we're going to construct this. We're really trying to hear from the scholars themselves, what are they saying that needs to be, what this needs to be built upon. And so this is the sort of process of that. I won't get into the weeds of that process because it is not the most romantic thing. But I essentially did 2 phases. The first phase was to interview scholars and get their input from their knowledge. And this, the idea of this is that we could go through, and we need to go through, and there's a lot of my colleagues here in this conference that are doing this work, going into the source texts. But you know, again, we can get lost in that world, and then we get back out into the abstract, and we're talking about clinical. And so this relates to human beings. And so I wanted to get the understanding of the people who know that knowledge, understanding what they think, how they think that that theoretical knowledge can actually apply to something like the field of psychology. And then phase 2 was to talk with clinicians, which I'll actually be talking about that in another talk later today, inshallah. And so I had 18 scholars that I interviewed from different aspects. Some of them were actually in Islamic psychology, some were Islamic philosophy from an academic standpoint, some were traditional Islamic psychology or Islamic spirituality practitioners, some were religious scholars within the tradition, some were religious academics. And so getting a broad range of different perspectives and people from different parts of the world as well. And so the themes that came out of this were the nature of the soul, the structure of the soul, stages of the soul, and development of the soul. It's really understanding the human being as a soul, not just this notion of the self, and that there's understanding the anatomy in order to understand the development towards clinical work. And so what came out of it was this version of an Islamic model of the soul. And so this is something that is just a visual representation of the data that came out of the study and represents something that goes way back to all of these scholars that have talked about. As a matter of fact, when I came up with the construction of this diagram, I thought, okay, certainly this has to exist because you know, it does exist. It's a model from the Quran. The decision of what to include and what not to include is part of that process of what makes sense for application. And it's interesting because the image that Dr. Rania showed of the model is actually a version that I did an illustration to make it look old, because the idea is that it's going back into the scholarly tradition that this knowledge is there, but then it's bringing it into the modern context in this way of sort of bringing it into a way that is easily understandable, inshallah. So this, I'll try to break it down in a short period of time, but I'll also put in the link, after the talk, I'll put in the link to the article that explains it more, as well as a video of me describing the model more. But essentially, the most important thing is that when we talk about from a Western standpoint, we're always talking about the self. There's self-help, there's understanding the self, and this self is really limited to this life, and it's not seeing it as a soul that is connected to God, right? And so first and foremost, Allah comes first in the conception from an Islamic standpoint, because we are subsisted by Allah and we are connected to Allah. So understanding of the self, or the soul in this case, has to first understand in relation to Allah. And so, you know, Allah created the dunya, created the human being, this being the sort of the body, the manifestation of the soul in the dunya. And the nafs is this part where usually when we talk about psychology, it's the self, it's talking about this separated individual self, the identity of the person from their own understanding and their self-direction. But from an Islamic perspective, we are directly connected to Allah, and we have Allah breathed into us the ruh. And so the ruh has this connection to our primordial state of being in witness of Allah, and not being, you know, understanding that we are in servanthood to Allah. And so understanding the different aspects of the soul is important to understanding psychology, because these come into play. So it's a longer trajectory of before this life and after this life, not just limited to the psychology from birth to this moment. And so in the dunya, we have shaitan influences through the nafs. And you know, the nafs oftentimes gets a bad rap. It's talked about as this negative thing, but really this is when the nafs is in a state of nafs al-amara bis-su, when the soul or the self that is inclined towards evil, but evil can even just be in forgetting its connection to Allah. But then we know that the nafs can also be nafs al-mutma'ina, right? So when it has this, it can be purified, it can be in a state of rest. And so therefore, the nafs is not innately evil. It has this beautiful possibility. It has a potentiality in it. And it is when it is turned, when it is in line with its ruh, it can be in its fitra state. The fitra of the ruh is to be in witnessing of Allah. Whereas when the nafs is in the state of nafs al-amara bil-su, it's in a state of ghafla, forgetful of this connection, and therefore just staying with that self. And so what happens is there becomes these two sort of potentialities, and the qalb in the middle is this regulating process that allows, you know, it's the center of the human being from an Islamic conception. And so the qalb is taqallab, it has this ability to turn. And so with the help of, you know, we talk about the aql as the intellect, but really aql is the ability for the heart to perceive things as they are. So it's more consciousness than it is just our thinking process or our deductive reasoning. This is like another aspect of. But when we engage in, you know, the qalb can, with the aql's help, or the aql, the yaqiluna function of the heart, do they not have hearts with which they perceive, right? Can turn the qalb one way or the other. So it has this turning capacity. When it is turned towards the nafs, and in a state of nafs al-amara bil-su, it's forgetful of its true nature. And this causes you know, symptoms of being disconnected. But when it is turned, when the qalb is turned to the ruh, it is in its fitra state, more aligned with the ruh, and in a state of nafs al-mutma'ina. And it is between these two sort of poles where we're struggling to come into awareness. And this is the state of nafs al-lawama. Allah swears by the nafs al-lawama, because this is really where we spend most of our time in this battleground of the soul. And this, in its doing this work of having self-awareness and doing the work of what we know as psychology, of coming to know the self, that we can be active in turning our heart towards our nature and bringing this sort of system into alignment. And then just, you know, the process of that is of this purple area where it's sort of determining which way you're oriented, is this jihad nafs, really working on the inner world of the self, and on higher levels of refining, or, you know, tazkiyat, this process of purification of the soul, of the self. And then just on the other side, you know, this, we could go into a long time of discussion, but I want to just move through this. The muhlikat, in Arabic, this means the destroyers, and these are the parts of, Al-Ghazali talks about the diseases of the heart, right? When you're out of alignment, when you're in ghafla, you accumulate these character traits, but our nature of our ruh is to have these beautiful character traits. The munjiyat are the saviors. And so you can think of these as, the scholars talk about these as the diseases and the cures. And then in between is, again, in this purple area, is where this battleground of the soul, the work that we're doing in psychology, that we be trying to do this inner work, the process of tahdhib al-akhlaq, of refinement of character in between these different character traits. And so this is the sort of picture of how we understand what are we trying to do in psychology from an Islamic perspective. And so the implications for this is just to understand what are we talking about when we're talking about psychology with the Islamic part at the beginning. How does that change psychology, right? When we're talking about human beings, because it's the way that we understand not only human nature, but where we're going, why we're here. It completely changes our orientation to treatment goals and therefore treatment. And so the idea is to build this foundational understanding to then build application and practical approaches from that. The limitations of this study, the methodology that was used is really dependent on the input of the participants. The participants that were chosen were really well-known and esteemed scholars, but still it is their understanding of that knowledge versus, what really needs to happen to build on this is to dive more into the sources, not only the Quran and the Sunnah, but also in the scholarly sources of the early Muslim scholars and contemporary work. And then, there is the beauty of why this can come in, we can talk about Islamic psychologies rather than just one psychology.
Just a 1 minute reminder.
1 minute, all right, I'm almost done. It's because the beautiful thing about Islam is that in our tradition, there's room for discussion and development and understanding how this is supposed to be applied in different contexts and in different times. And so this gives room to build on and to develop. So the future research to develop this, I will present the other part of this later today on how this works in clinical practice. And then, the idea is to start to work with this in understand what it's like from client's perspective, to build on this in specific areas of practice, as well as developing it in conversation with both scholars and practitioners. So I'll end there. These are some places where I can be found. The Internet IAIP website, where there's a lot of resources of pretty much all of the people presenting here. A lot of them, their works are there. I noticed somebody in the comment is asking for articles. There's a place you can go to find that there, and you can find out more about my work at Shifa Counseling. And I'll put the links to these articles in the chat. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Rothman. Now I want to turn over to our discussion. We are going to stop in 15 minutes, inshallah, and the keynote has been pushed to 15 minutes later, given the fact that we had some technical glitches when we started, affording us a little bit of an opportunity for discussion. I just want to make a couple of remarks just to synthesize a couple of things in my role as discussant. I'm first off very grateful to all of the panelists for really, mashallah, I feel like this was an amazing panel. It just brought so many different layers of the conversation. I think at the heart of it, what we're demonstrating is the richness of the Islamic intellectual heritage. Where Dr. Rania started us off with some illustrations going back to our tradition, from our tradition, of a lot of these conversations and contributions to human psychology at a time when the Western world was not, was shackling people to the basements of monasteries. Nihal, Psy.D. Nihal, Chaplain Nihal brought us over to discussing some of the fiqh, jurisprudential elements. He used, these were not Islamicized terms, right, from Western psychology, but if we look at it, really is talking about the not guilty by reason of insanity plea, and not fit to stand trial, and disability accommodations. And where is he deriving it from? He's pulling it straight out of the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And he is also drawing it from the discussions amongst the Sahaba. Dr. Rothman pulled and drew upon, you know, a sort of a holistic view on the ontology of the human being itself, the components and facets of the human being and the human psyche, and how do we conceive of and conceptualize of this being we call the human, right, and human psychology. And I did want to just kind of and of course Dr. Amber Haque is talking about the field as a whole, and he's talking about the conversations, these conversations that were demonstrated by the aforementioned panelists that I mentioned, some of the modern history around it. And he himself has written several articles on this, on not only the ontology of the human being, but also on the scholarly contributions. In fact, you know, prior to any of us on this panel that are a little bit younger than he is, mashallah. So he's a veteran and has that seniority over us. In fact, I was a grad student when I reached out to him and asked him if he might be willing to co-author my first publication, 2013, that he had a huge hand in influencing, alhamdulillah. And so I think this is demonstrating the richness. One of the things I want to comment on, in case it's sort of a question that might be begging, it's something that might be asking or in the minds of many, is well, what does this mean? Does this mean that, you know, we have a fully developed Islamic psychology that absolutely existed historically, and all we really need to do is to discard sort of Western psychology and just just rely upon all of these sources? I think that's a question that often comes about, and sometimes an extreme overreaction, in fact, among some individuals. But rather, I think what we are establishing and saying, and I think knowing everybody on this panel, I can confidently say by synthesizing everything that everybody's bringing, is that the Islamic tradition is so rich in the contributions and discussion of human psychology that we have been neglecting this whole gold mine, and we have this treasure store to share with the world. To Muslims that have had this store-bought, this treasure underneath them, that have been looking west post-colonially, right? But it's time for us to look back in our own tradition. When we look at the APA president 2 years ago who said we need to start looking east, it's only then we start to think about, oh wait, there might be some value to, you know, what the West is seeing in us. And so now we need to look at it. But I think this is to demonstrate that that value exists inherently. And the job of us is to bring that balance, right? The Quran says, كَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ, that we have created you a moderate nation so that you may be witnesses unto the people. كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. Right? You are the best nation that has been sent to human civilization ever. And you carry this rich legacy. And I think it's a way of being able to integrate and bring together all of these different conversations, right? Neglecting empirical science, but actually there's a place in it within the Islamic sciences. But the hikmah, as the Prophet ﷺ says, al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min fa'inama tajiduha fahuwa ahaqqu biha. The wisdom is the lost commodity of the believer. Wheresoever he or she finds it, we are most entitled to it. Why? Because we can reappropriate these conversations back within the foundations of the human being. In an ultra behavioral, secular, postmodernistic kind of world, you know, neglecting obviously all of the peripheral divergent diversity that exists, but these dominant frameworks, we need to be bringing back the conversation of metaphysics. We need to be bringing back the conversation of the human soul, the human heart, and not being shackled by the post-colonial dilemmas and false dichotomies that we have inherited, unfortunately, from our Eurocentric counterparts. And so this is really what this is about. And so I want to open the floor There is a question posed to Dr. Amber Haque. I don't know, Dr. Amber Haque, are you here? If so, please show your camera. I can't seem to locate you here. He may have jumped off, unfortunately. Okay, I don't see him, but for any of you on the floor. So it says that, you know, and perhaps you might be able to comment further, but the question is, somebody posed a question, well, you know what, secular psychology has all of this, you know, science behind it, demonstrated proof, right? And thousands of publications, but in Islamic psychology, do we find anything analogous? And how do we take what we have today? And again, you know, and I would add to the question that this is clinical practice, right? Mental health practice. How does it inform our practice? Whether it's chaplaincy, where there's psychiatry and psychotherapy, you know, how does it inform our actual interactions with patient care, Muslim patient care, or even beyond that? And it's open floor for any of you on the panel to really address.
Dr. Hooman, I'm not sure if we lost you there, but I hope you're still with us. Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, excellent.
Yes,
Mashallah.
anybody who wants to tackle that question?
You know, I could certainly start, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, but Dr. Hooman, I think honestly the best person maybe to tackle the question is actually yourself, considering the work of the Khalil Center and the exact, you know, this is exactly what the work of the Khalil Center does, is taking the understanding of the traditional Islamic psychology model and bringing it and integrating it very fully into modern day practice and clinical practice. Earlier in the talk, I spoke about how our noble predecessors had taken, it wasn't just theory that they worked with, but actually then implemented it practically. And you see the landmarks that you know, that it continued to be the trademark, if you will, of, you know, the clinical practice of psychology, which are these hospitals and these psychiatric wards, and in both the care and the aftercare. We could probably talk about this for so long, mashallah, but in the modern sense, I think what we're doing here essentially is taking from that the roots, of course, which for us is the Quran and the Sunnah, but also taking on all that scholarship that our scholars have actually worked on, and then also looking and not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, which is a really key and important point to this discussion. Because all of us, the reality is all of us have been trained in Western institutions, every single person on this panel. And there is so much good that is to be taken from modern Western psychology and psychiatry. But what we're saying is essentially there are certain elements that need to be analyzed closely and said, this is not working for Muslims. This is not going to fly. This is, and sometimes it may be good, but we have what's better within the tradition. And I think that's what's really key here. And that is the work of, you know, the work of Khalil Center and others that are working on this clinically as well, individual practitioners. Khalil Center is a group practice, but really bringing together clinicians who are trained fully in the field of psychology or psychiatry, whichever, or social work or family marriage counseling, or the current fields of counseling. And then from there, looking at the Islamic tradition and integrating it fully in. And I think that's what's really, you know, that's what's really exciting, I think, inshallah, at this moment in time, and really the peak of where we're kind of reaching this very important point in not just the scholarship, but in actual clinical implementation. So I'll let you, Dr. Hooman, take it from there.
Jazakallah khair. You know, I think in the next panel, I'll have an opportunity to present, in fact, at in the second panel on the IP track. So I'll sort of save any of my comments with regard to that for that. But we do have one focused transitioning from building the field to clinical practice. Dr. Rothman, could you speak to where does sort of the field go from here in the context of this conference? And what do, you know, we have, mashallah, like almost 200 people tuning in, and you as an executive director on this umbrella organization, you know, what could you speak to and make some comments on what do we do and where do we go from here? I mean, we were all witness to this amazing panel and presentations. So I guess in the minds of us, you know, where do we take this conversation?
Yeah, Bismillah. I'll keep it brief because Akila has just said that the keynote is starting. So, but you know, just to build off of what Dr. Rania is saying about, you know, certainly we've all been trained in the West, and there's a lot of good that comes from what we have learned from just the notion of psychology as a field. You know, I think there's a real benefit in understanding it not only as a field, but in this making it accessible for people in this way of how do you know, we have a problem, you go, you see a practitioner. And within the Muslim Ummah over time, like that used to be in place, but now there's few and far between people who have training in this specific area that you can go and get that type of guidance. Whereas it used to be, you'd have a sheikh in your village or in your town where you could go and get that guidance. And now we've been spread out, and so we need to adapt and really adapt the resources within our tradition to the modern times we are in. And Professor Malik Badri, you know, when he talked about that, building the construction, you know, you don't take a decrepit building and try to make it better by just putting a coat of paint on it, and therefore making, you know, something that doesn't work for the foundation of an Islamic